So Dan Dennett was he was a giant of both the philosophy and the cognitive science of the last 60-odd years. He called himself I'm what you get when you cross a Quine with a Ryle. Here, W.V. Quine was the great American philosopher who held that philosophy was completely continuous with science. Gilbert Ryle was the great British philosopher of mind who held that the mind is to be understood in a deflationary way, particularly closely tied to behavior. These were Dan's two major advisors, and he very much saw himself as inheriting and bringing together their legacies. I mean, another way to put it, due to my colleague Tom Nagel, is that Dan Dennett is Gilbert Ryle crossed with Scientific American. I gave that one to ChatGPT, and it actually did a pretty good job. That's young Dan looking pretty good there. So Dan got going with Quine and Ryle. His first book, 1968, is Content and Consciousness. Just think about that for a second. A book on consciousness from a philosophical and cognitive science perspective. In 1968, we think about, consciousness getting going, and whenever it was, the 1990s. Here we are, late 1960s. As with so many things, Dan was just way ahead of his time. I mean, there's a lot of very rich material in the book, some about aspects of the mind not closely tied to consciousness, but there are a few key chapters on consciousness. For example, here's one key distinction he makes, in the heavily analytic analysis of language style that he abandoned later on, but he probably inherited from Ryle here. A is aware one that P at time t, if and only if P is the content of the input state of A's speech center at time t. That is, what you're conscious of is basically what you can report. Versus A is aware two at time t, if this is the content of an internal event that is effective in directing current behavior at that time. So here he's basically pointing out the distinction between things that are reportable and things that can affect behavior, something which of course becomes absolutely crucial later on in all aspects of the science of consciousness. Also, he uses it to draw an important difference between human and animal consciousness. Only humans get to have awareness one, whereas animals can have awareness two. So this was just kind of laying the groundwork for much of what came later on in Dan's work. One of his most memorable books, I think, is Brainstorms, which came out 10 years later in 1978. Again, there's a lot of things in Brainstorms. It's really, I think of this book as, really inaugurating the widespread influence of the cognitive revolution in philosophy. The cover has got, three guys look out there in a rainstorm looking for, a sheep or something, looking surprising, quite a lot like Dan Dennett at the time, if you see. Here is Dan at his farm in Maine. There were maybe just 4 chapters of the book which were specifically about consciousness, but they're all incredibly influential. He gives a deflationary treatment of dreams, saying dreams are not conscious experiences, they're just memories. Of mental imagery, there's no such thing really as phenomenal mental imagery. You can't make a computer that feels pain because the whole concept of pain, he argues, is incoherent. Deflating all of these different conscious aspects of the mind in the way that became his trademark. Along the way, he also laid out a cognitive theory of consciousness. Here is Dan's cognitive theory of consciousness, circa 1978, 10 years ahead, of the global workspace model of Bernie Barr's, I might add. He changed a few details later, but this is a classic boxed and lines model of the phenomena. And if you were to say, for example, this seems to leave out phenomenology, this seems to leave out phenomenal consciousness, then he had a reply to you, developed in the article actually on mental imagery, where he makes this wonderful analogy between, suppose anthropologists discover a tribe that believed in an unheard of god of the forest called Phenoman. then the anthropologists have a choice. Do you take what they say at face value and study the properties of phenomenon, or do you just treat it like an anthropologist and study all the things they believe about phenomenon? And Dan was very much on the side of, let's just study all the things people say and think about phenomenon. That was his attitude towards consciousness, too. In the terms I've used, he's saying, instead of focusing on this so-called hard problem of consciousness, let's focus on the meta problem of why people believe and say these things about consciousness and believe things which may be true or may be false. And that's that kind of is really an inauguration of the broadly illusionist approach to consciousness that became very influential later on, at least to phenomenal consciousness. Around the same time, just a few years later, after the Mind's Eye, after Brainstorms, he published The Mind's Eye, co-authored with Doug Hofstadter. This is wonderful. This is actually the book that got me into philosophy and into issues about consciousness. I was about 15 or so when this came out, and I just devoured that book. I'd already read Hofstadter's Gödel, Escher, Bach, but this was the one that was really specifically philosophical, specifically about consciousness. And there's so many rich papers in there. But the one that actually resonated with me the most was also in Brainstorms, although I hadn't come across Brainstorms there yet. The last chapter of Brainstorms, the dessert, called Where Am I? The story about Dan Dennett, who had a version of Dan Dennett who has two different brains controlling his behavior. It's a complicated thing. He gets to be a robot body who goes looking for radioactive materials underground, and there's a natural and an artificial brain controlling his behavior. It's a wonderful science fiction story. Not everybody knows that there's actually a filmed version of this available on you can find on YouTube of Dan playing himself.
After such a switch, even though I could see and hear and feel and sense,
he's switching between the two brains.
I wouldn't be able to control it. But in any case, every time I've tried it so far, nothing's happened. Here, I'll show you. I thought you'd never turn that key. How I've longed for this moment.
Okay, you guys are going to have to go to YouTube to check this out for yourself. But it's a wonderful performance. The movie is Victim of the Brain, but it's just a reenactment of Dan's story. Where am I? Which is a wonderful depiction of issues about. This is actually about the self. Where is the self at these points? Is it where the brains are? Is it where the body seems to be? Is it in all these places, or none of them? It's just a wonderful piece of philosophy / science fiction / science. After Where Am I? There was his book, The Intentional Stance, not specifically about consciousness, but I mention it here because it's very relevant in this age now of AI and large language models. And his attitude was a system has beliefs or desires if we can take the intentional stance towards it. And many, we're reaching the point where we can take the intentional stance towards AI systems, treating them as believers and desirers. His line has consequences there. And then, of course, there is my magnum opus. Sorry, his magnum opus. Consciousness Explained. I'm very happy to take credit for it, but alas, no. This is, you all know Consciousness Explained. He gives his demolition, his arguments against what he calls Cartesian materialism and the Cartesian theater, his positive view, which he calls the multiple drafts model, his critical view of, qualia and phenomenal consciousness, elaborating his vision of illusionism. This book was just incredibly influential in getting the science of consciousness off the ground in the early 1990s. Suddenly, from a period where there hadn't been a lot on consciousness, there was just this bubbling up of activity from neuroscience. There was Crick and Koch. In psychology, there were people like Larry Weisskranz doing really important and central work. In physics, even there was Roger Penrose and others. But then, in philosophy, Dan Dennett, I think, did as much as anyone to inaugurate that wave of work on consciousness. And this book was very much at the center of it. Everybody, you know, many people disagreed with it, including me, but it was just very, you know, invigorating for the whole field to engage with this book. In the years after that, Dan developed and elaborated his views on consciousness in all kinds of directions. Kinds of minds, applied it to issues about animals, brain children, applied it to issues about consciousness in AI systems, from bacteria to bark and bark, concentrated especially on minds in simple organisms. Sweet Dreams is where he really tried to engage with philosophers and what he called philosophical obstacles to a science of consciousness. I think I may have been one of those myself. But yeah, this is a wonderful book. You know, Dan had a complicated relationship with philosophers. He was frustrated, but sometimes by philosophers' scholasticism. Philosophers were sometimes frustrated by, it was, you know, often very difficult to pin him down. Eric Schwitzgebel tells a nice story of offering 5 different versions of what Dennett's illusionism or heterophenomenology might be, and saying, now Dan, which one is your view? And Dan says, all of them. I like them all. So, you know, he could be hard to pin down, but I think this is also one of the things that made him so appealing for a broad community, scientists, general readers, and thinkers, is, you know, he didn't get bogged down in those little details. He had a very broad and powerful vision. Now to say something on the side of personal history. I first met Dan through my advisor, Doug Hofstadter. Here's a picture of Doug and Dan, where I was studying at Indiana as a grad student, starting in '89, and Dan came to visit our lab on a number of occasions, and we had many, many conversations about consciousness. I was just a nobody grad student, but I was writing papers, he was writing papers. We went back and forth. We found a few things to resonate about, in particular about the importance of the meta problem of consciousness, and of course a number of things to disagree about, including the importance of the hard problem of consciousness. But I found Dan incredibly encouraging and supportive. He wrote letters of recommendation for me when I first went on the job market, and he was just, as Carolyn said, he was a wonderful mentor. He was full of advice, he was full of suggestions. He didn't mind if you disagreed with him. He just loved being able to work with and talk to young people coming up in the field. Come around, a few years later, or I guess around '94, first Tucson Consciousness happened. I gave a talk on the hard problem, and just a few months after that, actually, I got an email, somewhat out of the blue, from Dan saying, "Oh, well now, David, you're now well known as the distinguisher between the hard and the easy questions. If you have some new persuasions to offer on this, especially discuss specifically the failures or shortcomings of his work, then come here to Tufts and talk about it. Since your contribution seems to have been gratefully received, it'd be valuable to see in direct application to my theory. Want to do it? So that's Dan. It's like, okay, you disagree with me? Great, come here. Let's talk about it. Let's have it out. I went to Tufts, had a wonderful time. Don't think I convinced Dan of anything. Not sure he convinced me of anything. But it was just a wonderful experience. Dan was not one to squelch dissent. He was one to really encourage it. Dan also made an appearance at, I think he wasn't at the first Tucson conference in '94. He was at the second one in '96. This one was from sometime around that time. There's Dan and Sue Blackmore. Memorably was his remarks. I think he gave the opening talk at the second Tucson conference, where he started it by saying, "Now I know what it felt like to be a cop at Woodstock." To be a policeman at Woodstock. It's like, here there are all these people with all these crazy behaviors and crazy ideas, and I have to police all of that. Maybe it was some of the attitude of being the anthropologist, of the phenomenologists. He had some of that attitude towards ASSC as well, but he had a marvelous time there. I think at ASSC, he came to a couple of the early conferences. He was president in 2006. I think the one he enjoyed the most was ASSC 11 at Las Vegas in 2007, where there was this famous symposium. I don't know how many people here were there on the 11. Anil, anyone else? I'm sure Axel was there. Okay, Axel. Yeah, okay, Anil and Axel, you guys at least, and maybe some others. On the magic of consciousness, where the conference was in Las Vegas, so they got some of the great Vegas magicians in residence, the amazing Randy Apollo Robbins Teller from Penn and Teller, to talk about magic and kind of explain how they use control of attention and consciousness in their magic. And Dan loved this. I mean, I think there was an event where he tied Randy up to a chair, and then Randy magically escaped in no time. And from then on, Dan would just kind of use this metaphor of the magic of consciousness in so much of his work to express his illusionist views. Illusionism, key to magic. Illusionism, also key to understanding consciousness. Consciousness is basically a bunch of magic tricks that the mind plays on us, and we have to understand them. So I think that was, and ASSC then played a very special role for him in that. And he came back many times to ASSC over the years, including last year when he at least sent a video in for the public event last year. I have to mention this extremely memorable trip to Greenland in 2014, which Dan cooked up with Dmitry Volkov, the Russian entrepreneur who's head of the Moscow Center for Consciousness Studies. And this was basically to get together a bunch of philosophers and cognitive scientists to get on this sailing boat that fits about 30 or 40 people for a week and explore Greenland. Actually, we explored Greenland in the mornings. We talked about consciousness in the afternoons, and we drank in the evenings. It was a wonderful time. I mean, who was there? Here's Dan on the ship. Here's Dan with Paul Churchland. Pat Churchland was there. Andy Clark, Nick Humphrey, Martina Niederrumelin, Jesse Prince, many others. It was just a wonderful time. Again, really put on by Dan, who wanted to bring together people here doing, he loved to combine work with pleasure, or as he'd think of it, combining pleasure with pleasure, exploring Greenland, doing philosophy. It was a marvelous time. And here's a bunch of people there. There's Andy Clark, there's Dirk Pereboom, Philip Goff, Pat Churchland at the back. There's Claudia. Here's Dan with two of his greatest friends, Nick Humphrey and Keith Frankish, playing this Scrabble-like game of frigate bird that absorbed insane amounts of their time. Here's Dan at a conference we had at NYU, just maybe 2018, on animal consciousness. It was a great conference, and there's this wonderful photo of God's light shining down on Dan in a way of which he would thoroughly have disapproved, but it's a wonderful photo. This is from a conference just 3 months ago, at the end of March. Last time I saw Dan, it was just 3 weeks before he died. It was a conference at Santa Fe it was on reality. It was on reality as approached from many, many different directions: philosophy, physics, AI, neuroscience, psychology, social sciences, and so on. It was a marvelous conference, and Dan loved it. He was just he was in marvelous form throughout. He was physically fragile at this point, but mentally, totally on top of things. He was so engaged the whole time, asking a question every time. At the end, this is his talk at the end, where he said, "This is the best workshop I've ever been to." That was slightly generous, if you ask me, but it just shows the spirits he was in. At that time, I spent a lot of time at this with Dan and with Susan, his wife, and I'm very glad for that. In retrospect, none of us had any idea that in 3 weeks he would be gone. I think actually it was about a week after that, Van and Marie, the filmmakers you've seen wandering around here, did an interview with him, which I'm sure must have been the last interview he ever did. And I don't know if we're going to see those video clips today, but at some point that'll make it out, and I'm really interested to see that. then he had a couple of days after that, he had a fall, and then he died from complications to his lung disease, and he'll be enormously missed. Dan had a thirst for life, for living, for understanding, for seeing the world and bringing different things and different fields and insights together. He just loved engaging in the activity of the life and the activity of the mind, and he had a vision to match his thirst. He had a vision of the mind, but he had a vision of consciousness. He had a vision of free will. He had a vision of the self. He had a vision of evolution. He had a vision of religion. He had a way of bringing ideas from all these fields together into a grand synopsis, into a grand vision that would then resonate with so many people and help them to understand the world. He had a life force. He had an incredible life force. I mean, there was just something. The guy had a will, that was just unmatched to understand these things and then to do something with it, to write them down, to get them out, to give talks, to find out more, to connect with more. It was just his life force was extraordinary, which makes it so hard to believe that now he's gone. I'm honored to have been his adversary, and I'm privileged to have been his friend. Thank you.